going to go ahead and start the broadcast.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Oscar, go ahead. You can start the meeting.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. The January 14th, 2020 meeting of the Santa Barbara Ordinance Committee is now called to order. Ms. Clerk, may we have a roll call, please?
I'm just going to correct the date of May 19th, 2020. Councilmember Mike Jordan.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Here.
Chair Oscar Gutierrez.
Present.
Okay, I'll read the item that's going to be heard today. Subject: an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara amending section 9.97.010 of the Santa Barbara Municipal Code pertaining to sitting or lying down on public sidewalks on certain high traffic portions of Cacique and Milpa Streets. Recommendation that the Ordinance Committee consider proposed amendments to the Municipal Code section 9.97.0.10 pertaining to sitting or lying down on public sidewalks on certain high traffic portions of Cacique and Milpa Streets, and forward the ordinance amendments to City Council for introduction and adoption.
Madam Clerk, are we supposed to open it up to general public comment?
Yes. Ms. Gorman, do we have public comment? Not on the agenda.
We have two public speakers. Mark Alvarado has raised his hand for this item. Mr. Alvarado, I'm not sure if you wish to speak on general public comment or on this item. We'll go ahead and call on you, and if you could just please let us know if you wish to speak on this, on general public comment or on the sit-lie ordinance extension. He's taken his hand down, so we have no speakers for items not on the agenda.
Thank you.
Okay, may we have a staff report, please?
Thank you, Chair Oscar Gutierrez, members of the Ordinance Committee. We are following up today on the April 28th action taken by the city administrator in his role as Director of Emergency Services to issue an emergency order addressing sitting, lying down, and camping under the Milpas and Cacique freeway underpasses. Next slide, please. By way of background, the city's sit-lie ordinance goes back to about 1997, and it operated pretty much on State Street only until about 2015. In 2015, due to really dramatically increasing foot traffic and late night activities, the council expanded the hours of the sit-lie ordinance from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. all the way up until 2 a.m. As you can imagine, the night traffic between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m. Can be quite intense on State Street. And so there was a good justification for increasing those hours. In addition, in 2015, again, with respect to State Street, the council added basically the kinds of street furniture that's not meant to be sit on, meaning there were issues around things like planters or railings or statues that were being turned into places to sit or lie down and thereby obstructing passage on the sidewalk. So that's kind of a brief history. Next slide. It's important to understand that the ordinance is not only limited in the hours of the day it covers, 7 a.m. to 2 a.m., but also it's limited geographically. Currently, as I mentioned, it applies only to the first, I believe it's 13 blocks of State Street. and 1 block of Haley. Council will recall that in 2018, a sidewalk obstruction problem developed in the 0 to 100 block of East Haley in the vicinity, although across the street from the Falding Hotel. The council responded to that by extending the sit-lie ordinance to that 1 block off of State Street. Now, again, the limited locations and limited times are necessary in the ordinance in order to make it legally defensible. It's, next slide, please. The courts have recognized a pretty simple and straightforward reason for having these kinds of ordinances, and that is sidewalks are for people moving about. When someone sits or lies down on the sidewalk and obstructs passersby, that's not acceptable, and the courts have allowed cities to regulate that. It's an issue of safety and sidewalk obstruction, however. The fact that groups congregated on the sidewalks might be engaged in nuisance or criminal behavior is really not what we're trying to address with the sit-lie ordinance, nor what the city can really try and address lawfully. The sit-lie ordinance is about the obstruction of the sidewalk in places where there's really no alternative for people to walk. So coming back to Cacique and Milpas, we know that both of those streets are heavily trafficked by cars. Both of those locations are either immediately adjacent to or part of a freeway on-ramp, off-ramp systems. People coming on and off the freeway are moving at high rates of speed. They may be unfamiliar with the city, more so than people at an interior point in the city. So a pedestrian having to take the chance to get off the sidewalk and walk on Milpas or Cacique is a very dangerous situation. And that factual justification applies to, in my opinion, warrant a sit-lie ordinance in these locations. Next slide. This is an effort to describe the general vicinity with a photograph. Unless I'm the presenter, I can't point, but I can describe what we're looking at. If you begin just at about 11 o'clock and work your way down, you'll see an oval shape immediately adjacent to the freeway. That is what I would characterize as the Carpinteria Milpas US 101 roundabout. If you would click the next, just click through, Nicole, to the next slide, please. Here it is in a little tighter detail. And again, you can see the roundabout in the upper left of this frame. In the lower right, you will see a brown area that is the ball field across the street from the hotel. And that sits at the intersection of Calle Puerto Vallarta and South Milpas. That would be the lower reach of Milpas where this sit-lie would apply. If you click, we should start to see some definition, just a single click, Nicole. Okay, one more. All right, so the first red line is illustrating the reach of Milpas from Calle Puerto Vallarta on the bottom right up through the roundabout at Carpinteria Milpas and US 101. Click again, please. The second red line represents Cacique between South Milpas and South Alisos. The sit-lie ordinance would apply there. And one more click, please. Finally, the oval represents the roundabout and the areas within which the sit-lie ordinance would be applicable. Next slide, please. those are the comments I wanted to make. And Nicole, if you back up one, perhaps we can leave it there for committee questions and discussion. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Colon. At this moment, do any of my colleagues have questions for staff? Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. So is this, what we're talking about is extending beyond what's already in place on Milpas? And how far does that extend? Or is there anything that extends beyond the roundabout at this point?
Thank you, Chair Oscar Gutierrez, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon. This would not extend above Carpinteria. This is precisely the same area covered by Mr. Casey's April 28th emergency order.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Colon, I just have a couple questions in the staff report part on how you lay out the case. I'm sure from a legal standpoint, and one of them is on, you'll know this, it's on page 3 near the bottom where you talk about the city being careful to couple social remedies with any new ordinances. And the particular event or period of time that gives rise to this ordinance was met with, I guess, a remarkable amount of social remedy at that time. So in the future, I don't anticipate that the remedies will be available to that extent. Does there always have to be a social remedy of having somewhere else for a person who's sitting in line to go where he or she can get the help they need that is similar to what took place on that Tuesday when the Cacique Bridge the underpass was cleared out?
Chair Oscar Gutierrez, Councilmember Jordan, no, I don't think that we will either have the ability or the need to provide that kind of service with this ordinance. We were required to treat the people who had remained sitting and lying down on Cacique and Milpas as encampments within the meaning of the governor's executive orders related to COVID-19. As you've heard from Ms. Doubles, because they were encampments, the state felt it better to leave them in place to facilitate their access to medical and other services. When the emergency conditions are lifted, we will have one social service obligation, but it's not related to sitting or lying down between 7 a.m. and 2 a.m. It's related to camping. When people are subject to arrest for camping, the city needs to make sure that they have rejected alternative offers of housing, temporary or otherwise, before they are threatened with arrest. The Martin v. City of Boise case has now been rejected for review by the Supreme Court, so it remains the law of the Ninth Circuit. And that case says that before we can prevent someone from camping, there needs to be a demonstration that there is available shelter for them.
Very good. All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. Mr. Colon, right now, the area in red on the map is what's being recommended, but the residents that live in the surrounding neighborhoods feel like that's not enough, that it should be farther or the entire length of Milpas Street, and as well as some of the other surrounding streets. How would we go about expanding that kind of enforcement?
Thank you, Chair Oscar Gutierrez. The issue is, what are the facts? If the facts show that there are sidewalk obstructions caused by people sitting and lying down, the council can address that. So the kinds of things we need to look at are, how wide are the sidewalks in the areas where we want to apply the ordinance? What are the traffic conditions? How heavily trafficked are the sidewalks by people? By way of comparison, the council imagined State Street as a very heavily traveled tourist corridor between the waterfront area and the remainder of downtown, up as far as, I've forgotten Victoria, I think, first 13 blocks. I can't imagine the council believing that the Milpas corridor is an equally important business district for the city. As you can see from the slide on the screen right now, there is a concentration of visitor serving uses at the beachfront terminus of Milpas. Multiple hotels, multiple vacation type condos, the zoo. So I think if the council wants to reimagine Milpas as a visitor serving corridor, we would look at things like sidewalk width, how much pedestrian traffic, how much vehicle traffic, and come back to the council with a recommendation on whether we thought sit-lie was the appropriate remedy. So the answer is yes, it can be done, but there is a process, and that's some of why it's taken time to address these various situations. It's somewhat labor intensive to gather the data that we need.
Okay. Thank you for that, Mr. Colon. Ms. Crescente, may we have the speakers for public comment?
Ms. Gorman, do we have public comment for this item?
We do have, there are two people which are online.
Can't really hear you. Your mic is up. There you go.
Sorry about that.
It's all good.
We do have two public speakers, Mr. Alvarado and Mr. Shaheen. If you would like to speak on this item, please raise your hand. I do believe from previous correspondence, Mr. Alvarado would like to speak on this item. So Mr. Alvarado, I am going to unmute you. You may state your name and go ahead. Mr. Alvarado, go ahead.
Ms. Gorman, this is Ms. Gorman. This is Tino de Guevara speaking. I'm not sure Mr. Alvarado is on today, but if he isn't, I would be happy to speak in his behalf.
If you could just please state your name for the record one more time.
Yes, ma'am. This is Tino, T-I-N-O is my first name. Last name is De Guevara, spelled capital D-E, and then space, capital G-U-E, V is in Victor, A-R-A.
Very good. Yes, please go ahead.
And Ms. Gorman, I will be keeping track of time on a 3-minute timer that I have at my desk.
Wonderful. And Mr. de Guevara, I'm not sure who to mute. I'm either going to mute you or Mr. Alvarado. So if you can't speak, hold on one sec. Okay, go ahead, Mr. de Guevara. Okay, we'll try the other one then.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes,
thank you very much. Yes, I've been working with Mr. Mark Alvarado, as well as the representative from the Neighborhood Advisory Council, Sebastian Aldana, and we were instrumental in getting the Cacique area cleaned up. As we walk north from the roundabout, we have been noticing that there are numerous people on the sidewalk that are passed out, some on businesses, in front of businesses, And we put together a PowerPoint slide. So we do have some evidence to show that people are obstructing places on the sidewalk. That usually occurs all the way up to Mason Street. But if you go up Mason Street, there are also other folks that are sitting on bus stops and have their trailers, if you will, and they're sleeping under those trailers also on the sidewalk. This usually happens at night. Yes, they pick up in the morning, but they are still there. They return in the evening. So we're very concerned to be able to extend the ordinance to Cañón Perdido Street, as we have noticed a lot of people on the north end there by the liquor store and the bus stop that are in the way, and people have to walk around them. And we'd be happy to present that to council at your convenience, as we are now gathering signatures and information from folks who are having these issues. Is there any questions?
Any of my colleagues have questions? I think we're good. Thank you, Tino. Can we have the next caller, please?
Chair, we do have, I believe now Mark Alvarado himself will try and unmute him, and he would be the last speaker. And and it may not be Mr. Alvarado. If it's Mr. Duguevara again, then we're done. So Mr. Alvarado, if you're on, you can say hello. Looks like we do not have Mr. Alvarado. It looks like it was only Mr. Duguevara. So I believe we don't have any further public comment on this item.
Okay, thank you, Madam Clerk. I'd like to have my colleagues make a motion if they feel inclined. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. I was wondering if we might have some discussion, or if I might ask another question. I mean, given the criteria that Mr. Klon mentioned of how wide the sidewalk is, and traffic considerations, and how heavily trafficked, I would say the Milpas corridor, those are very narrow sidewalks. When we just had that discussion with Rob Dayton, and how narrow the sidewalks are, with a lot of photographs of how two strollers can't pass each other. And I would be in favor of extending this up to Canon Perdido, or to wherever is justified through the criteria that Mr. Kalan mentioned, or at least looking into it further. I mean, I think an emergency setting that we had, and with COVID and not being able to open that up, this was necessary right in this area. But since we're talking about it, I would be in favor of passing this now, and then with looking into extending it further up the Milpas corridor, which really is an important financial corridor and is well traveled. So I think it could be justified given the reasons that Mr. Kalan mentioned. But I don't know if I'll support this, and then with the possibility of looking into extending it up to at least Canon Perdido, or possibly further, depending on what the recommendations are.
Can't hear you.
Chair Gutierrez, if I may, Mr. Alvarado is on the line and would like to comment.
Sure, go ahead, Mr. Alvarado.
Mr. Alvarado, you are online. You can unmute yourself and speak. Let's try one other way. Mr. Alvarado, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself and you may speak.
Ms. Gorman, I'm still on the line. I'm waiting for Mr. Alvarado to answer, but you still have me unmuted.
Okay, very good. We have you under Mr. Alvarado's name also. We'll mute you. So Mr. Alvarado, this is...
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Very
All right,
good.
I'm
Go
so
ahead.
sorry.
Perfect.
Anyhow, thank you, good morning. Am I on, Oscar?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So just to follow up on Mr. De Guevara's comments, we are organizing to expand or to propose the expansion beyond Milpas and Cacique. We recognize that there's just a lack of homeless outreach services or resources on the Milpas corridor. And so we propose that the ordinance be the full stretch from Cabrillo Boulevard all the way up to Cañón Perdido. And we are working with our district representative to conduct outreach to the neighborhood serving businesses and other residents. And we just kind of feel that homelessness is really an unacceptable reality that we're dealing with. And we feel that by expanding the ordinance for the full stretch is that it's going to allow us to kind of create the reach that we need to bring more resources for homeless services into the neighborhood. I think you might have gotten my slides that I had submitted earlier to the city clerk, and you saw the pictures, and the pictures were just to demonstrate the impact that we're dealing with on Milpa Street. We're working also with Rob Dayton. Some of you know that the sidewalks are very narrow, sometimes less than 4 feet wide in some areas, right in front of businesses. And we just kind of feel that this is a necessary tool to have, especially working with Rob on the redevelopment of Milpas. And as you very well know, we're just waiting on a grant to get the whole redevelopment of the whole corridor so that it can be equitable to a state street in terms of resources and bringing in things like an ambassador program in order to really, assist our most vulnerable, because the people that are there are the most chronic, dual diagnosed with, addiction and behavioral health issues, and they really need the wraparound services. And when I talk to homeless folks, I ask them, is anybody doing outreach? And 8 out of 10 times, I'm getting a no. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I really appreciate you guys looking at this, and we'll follow up with our representative to understand kind of the legislative process to see if we can actually get this on the agenda for the subsequent city council hearing on this particular item. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alvarado. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Colon, if you're still on there, can you tell me the status of the emergency order, emergency proclamation, what the expiration timeline is for that?
June 22nd, 2020, Councilmember Jordan.
So relatively soon, I would call that, right? For looking at extending or not adopting this and then bringing it back and going to work on a longer stretch up Milpas?
Correct, but I see these as distinct issues. So you could couple this with a broader extension, or you could pass this and direct us to look at a broader extension, or recommend to the council that the council direct us to look at a broader extension.
Right, I guess so my blunter question is, could you accomplish all that before the emergency order expires, or is that pretty uncomfortable?
We've had some discussion internally. I think the conditions are fairly obvious up through Mason and perhaps Yananali. When you get much above Mason, we don't have the consistent data readily available, and would need to look at that. So that would be Mason being Crown Liquor, Yananali being the bank and McDonald's. Just
Okay.
to put it in graphic terms.
So based on that, I'm open to either pathway. I'm open to adopting today or recommending adoption today, and asking staff to come back either with another one that's a shorter distance on Milpas and begin the work on the extension on Milpas even further above that, or just asking staff to roll that all into one work product and come back. I don't have a problem with anything I've heard. The only disquieting thing I heard was one of the public speakers seemingly make a nexus to an extension of linear sit-lie prohibition leading to increased homeless services. And I don't really see anything in my history of watching the homeless dynamic that sees a link of greater services appearing when we put greater prohibition on it. So those to me are not something that play off of each other. So be careful what you wish for there. But so I could do any one of those three things. Like it is today, give it back to the city attorney's office for what he just described as an extension up to Mason or Yananoli, because that could come back before the order expires, or adopt or recommend adoption today, and then turn the entire length of Milpas, as we've heard discussed, back to the city attorney's office for work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chair Gutierrez, I want to correct. I misspoke. I meant 500 or Mason, not Yananoli. I misread my map. 500 is Crown Liquors and Mason is Wells Fargo and McDonald's.
So that'll work. Just amend what I think the choices are that I'd support. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. So if I'm understanding, one pathway could be to pass this, recommend adoption of this as an emergency measure, and send it to city attorney's office with the additional assignment of looking at this. And I would like it to look all the way up through Canon Perdido, even though we're not maybe seeing yet what that evidence is. But since there's been neighborhood and public request that we look up to Canon Perdido, I think that would be a good idea. No reason not to if we're looking at it anyway. That is heavily trafficked, as you have high school right there. And even though we're not in session physically right now, when we do go back into full session, there's a lot of foot traffic in that area at certain times of day. So I think it's definitely worth looking at as a well-trafficked corridor. So I'd be in favor of making that motion, unless there was a way for us to just do it today, which I think I'm not hearing that that's an option, to just recommend that this extend, and then it's a short-term fix. So I'm Mr. Kalan. I'm sorry, Chair Gutierrez.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Mr. Colon.
Thank you, Chair Oscar Gutierrez. Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, I think there are three options. You could approve what's in front of you today and recommend further study to the council. You could approve what's in front of you today with the addition up to Mason or 500, either, Mason being the further of the two, and recommend further study to the council. Or you could, any variant of those two options, basically. So you can, I believe the evidence is there to allow you to extend as far as Mason today. Have little doubt that between Wells Fargo and McDonald's down through to Calle Puerto Vallarta, there's heavy traffic.
Well then, thank you. Mr. Chair, I would like to recommend that we take that option 2 that Mr. Kalan just described, where we, I'd like to move that we amend today's recommendation to include up to Mason Street with recommendation for further study up to Canon Perdido.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion by Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon and a second by Councilmember Jordan. I agree with that. I would also support that motion. I feel like we need to do something right now because it needs to be done. And I feel like there should definitely be more research done and more community input from the residents that live in that area about stretching it out further. Like I've stated in the past, people who have lived there their whole life know that this is definitely an issue that's been there for decades, and I think it's time now that we finally find a solution to try to alleviate it, and hopefully this will be that solution. Mr. Colon?
Yes, thank you, Chair, for recognizing me before the committee votes. Should this motion pass on June 2nd, we will present this ordinance to the council for introduction, along with a report that identifies the further steps we need to pursue to study up through to Ken and Perdido.
You said that's June 2nd?
I believe so. I don't believe we have a meeting next Tuesday.
Is it possible to have some sort of community input workshop where we ask the members of the community that live in that area to voice their opinion and give their input on this situation before June 2nd, since we're going to be voting on it, just so that we have more data? I know you're very, very big on having data to back up any of our plans.
Wow. I'm stumped a little bit because of our barriers to face-to-face meetings. Ordinarily, I'd say, yes, I could conduct an evening workshop to gather information, but between now and June 2nd, I don't think I could do it. I would be happy to include a civic engagement proposal like that in the recommendations for the Part 2 study up to Ken and Perdido.
Okay.
Does that work?
Yeah, I mean, so you don't think there could be a virtual workshop either, or something where the city sends out a newsletter asking for input, like either phone calls or emails or what have you?
Yes, but I can't accomplish that by June 2nd. I'm sorry.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, so there's a motion on the floor, is that correct? We can have that
Yes.
motion read out loud.
That is correct. Recommendation moved by Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon to include up to Mason Street, second by Councilmember Jordan.
Okay.
I'll take a roll call.
With the addition of a recommendation that the council direct further study up through to Ken and Perdido.
Correct.
Councilmember Jordan,
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon,
Yes.
Chair Oscar Gutierrez.
Aye. So that's unanimous.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Colon. Okay, with that, I believe we are adjourned unless there's anything else my colleagues or anybody else wants to add. Hearing none, I adjourn this meeting. Thank you very much.